I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me my newest contributor from Manchester, England, Ted Butler. Welcome back, Ted.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Good to see you in Toronto earlier this year, and pleasure to be spending Easter Sunday doing a podcast with you.
Yeah, it's a nice way to kick off Easter. Let's talk about Toronto before we get into today's podcast. This was your very first PDAC. I was just curious on what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I thought it was a bigger event than I expected it to be. There were potentially 27,000 people there, I believe. I thought the energy was good, the conversations were productive, the mining companies were impressive. I mean, obviously there are some red flags as there are in every situation, but for the most part, I felt that the sentiment was turning. I feel that I still kind of have that optimism, given that I'm kind of new to the industry, but it seems to me that, especially with the recent movement in the gold price and the oil price, which we'll be talking about today, there seems to be a lot more optimism, and the pessimism seems to be fading.
Yeah, that's a pretty good take on things. It's a little overwhelming that first PDAC because yes, it's very large compared to a lot of the other events that we attend. So it's really easy to get lost in there too. I even me as a veteran, I find after 3 days, all the companies start to sound alike.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So in my March April edition, you wrote a very nice piece about the resurgence of old energy, and that's what we're going to talk about on today's podcast. For those that are listening, we'll put a link direct to that article at the bottom of the comments page. Before we get into that, let's start by defining what exactly we're going to be talking about today. So, when you talk about old energy, what exactly are you meaning?
Yeah, so old energy is kind of like a blanket term for oil, gas, coal, LNG, all the kind of energy sources that have been used in recent history, maybe going back to 100 years. Obviously, green energy, I'm referring to solar, wind, biofuels, all the sort of new age of energy. So yeah, that's the characterization, really.
Okay, and we're talking about energy grid usage, not transportation usage.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So, in the article, you point out that old energy is in fact like the Black Knight from Monty Python. I'm not dead yet.
Exactly. It's still intact, much to the contradiction of what a lot of people think. It's quietly increasing. For example, in the US, domestic oil production increased to an all-time high in 2023. This was largely thanks to the shale output from the Permian Basin, which has increased around 600% since 2007. Over on the other side of the world, we have China hitting a coal production record in 2023. In fact, it produced more coal in the first half of 2023 than the entire of 2021 coal production. So this is all going on in the background. And as for industrializing countries as well, in Indonesia, coal production hit a record high in 2023 with 775.2 million. And Bangladesh also hit coal-fired output record, tripling its production to 21 billion kilowatt hours. That was the grid. And then it's back to the developed world again. I mean, the UK, famous for its history of industrialization, opened new licenses in the North Sea for oil and gas. And of course, Germany has been quietly opening coal plants. So this idea that old energy is dead is really a fallacy.
Yeah, it's amazing. If you listen to the environmental movement, they would suggest that coal was the first thing to go, and it sounds like it's not only not leaving, it's actually growing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do believe that will continue. Firstly, the reason for that is a phenomenon called Jevons Paradox, which is the work by Adam Rosenzweig of Goring and Rosenzweig research. And it was a fantastic insight, actually. It really opened my eyes to the extent at which old energy is really seeing a resurgence. I mean, the first thing to note about that is that contrary to popular belief, when the world becomes more efficient at producing energy, historically it demands more of it. In other words, less energy being used per unit of GDP creates an increase in the size of the global energy consumption pie, along with old energy's slice of it. Now, this obviously differs in a case where we have a recession. For example, in 2009, we did see a drop-off in global energy consumption. But generally, the rule of thumb is that as efficiency increases, it becomes cheaper, and the energy consumption increases. So this is why demand is not really as big of a concern as many people initially think it is for old energy.
So as we get more efficient, are we burning more or are we burning less of the old energy?
We're burning more. We're burning more because it incentivizes demand because it becomes cheaper. So that really incentivizes countries at a time as well where we're in a recession, potentially. Well, in the UK, we're in a recessionary environment. In China, not a recession, but certainly a deflationary spiral that's potentially going to lead to an economic downturn. And this all makes the cheapness of old energy a lot more attractive to these countries, and especially for industrializing countries. I mean, the amount required for them to roll out renewable infrastructure is just far more than their budget allows for. And so the lowest hanging fruit, the path of least resistance really is to continue with the existing old energy infrastructure because it's cheaper. And I think we're going to continue to see that.
So the movement to green energy, then this is really a first world problem and not a third world problem. The third world is continuing on the path of old energy, as if I'm, with the exception of Germany, which is probably brought on by the Russian-Ukraine conflict. It's the countries you mentioned are all developing nations rather than Western nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of a trend for industrializing countries because they're not really the ones waving the flag for the green energy movement. This is more something that's being imposed upon them by the developed countries, rather irrationally, to be honest, because how on earth can they afford to do so? But I don't think the green energy is dead. I think the important distinction that I would make and that I made in the article is that the forthcoming decade will be characterized by a subsistence of both energy forms as the world slowly straddles across from brown to green. So I truly believe that the answer is both, not either or. It's just something I wanted to note was that old energy is seeing an increase and it's kind of going under the radar of a lot of market participants.
Now, on a geopolitical front, and we take a look at it as well, a lot of the developing nations of the world are joining the BRICS, group as far as an economic area. BRICS nations tend to be nations that produce a lot of the oil, gas, and coal that would go into these power plants. Is that also helping to drive that BRICS versus the West split?
Definitely. I think the BRICS combined share, if you add OPEC as well, is probably at least over 50% of oil production. The US holds roughly a 19% share, but that's really the West's main foot in the door in that sense. In Africa, as we spoke about before, China and Russia are gaining a foothold, and particularly investing in infrastructure that will allow them to derive oil production from those countries. So I think that's something we're going to see more. I think the BRICS share of oil production will continue to increase. And really, the US is so dependent on shale from the Permian Basin. The question is, how long can it continue, or should it really start to go all in on renewables and solar? But then the problem with that is that China also has a stronghold with some 60% share, 60 to 80% share, I think, of the solar capacity. So across the board, China still dominates both old energy production and green energy production, really.
Yeah, China has definitely done their homework in those areas, and they believe that if they can create a monopoly, that it's good for their strategic place in the world. So, where does this leave countries like South Korea and Japan, which are geographically kind of in amongst a lot of BRICS nations, but are more Western aligned?
Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a dichotomy. They're stuck in the middle, to quote Steelers Wheelers, and they have a choice to make. I think they'll probably try to continue appeasing both sides. Japan is obviously notoriously sides with the West on a lot of things, but geographically, its position to Asia is a lot more conducive to trading with those countries. But yeah, I think that they'll continue to operate in a nuanced way, and I think they have to.
So where does this leave the green energy movement? Is it dead? Is it sleeping? Is it alive and well and just continuing to chug on at its current pace?
It's certainly not dead, and it certainly will happen. It's just going to happen at a much slower pace than was originally anticipated, and what was forecasted by the different organisations and multilateral conferences in the world. For example, solar on its own made up 75% of global renewable capacity additions in 2023. And in fact, the spot prices for solar modules are declining by almost 50% year on year in 2023. And that was when manufacturing capacity reached 3 times the 2021 level. So I think solar is probably the best bet in terms of straddling across from old energy. I just think it's going to take a lot longer than was originally anticipated.
How about the other forms of energy, the uraniums of the world, the thermal power generations, the wind generations, the tidal generations? Are they just simply too inefficient, and we need to rethink that, or is there still roles for them?
I think there's still roles for them. I mean, uranium's obviously had a brilliant bull run recently. Um, Volatile market still. I mean, France is dependent on a third of its grid for on nuclear. So there are still facets of the world, of course, that are dependent on uranium, and I think nuclear will continue to grow. As for wind, I think really it depends. Every energy source depends on the environment it's in. So, we're going to see a lot more solar in hot, sunny countries, wind maybe in Scotland. It really is determined by the environment. So, personally, I believe the case for wind is much less of a compelling one than solar, purely because solar's already achieving the efficiencies in cost reduction. As I mentioned, solar PV modules declining by almost 50% year on year in 2023. So we will start to see that Jevons Paradox phenomenon come about, where the efficiency is increasing and the demand and consumption will increase on the back of that. But the point is that coal production is still much cheaper on many metrics than it is to roll out the infrastructure for solar and all the wind and all the other renewable sources of energy. So until the point at which that we reach that threshold where solar becomes cheaper, the industrializing countries will still have a preference for old energy.
The final question I have in the big picture of all of this then is government policy going to get in the way and create a new energy crisis? Because, we have governments in the West that are, very strongly, if you look at the Biden administration, they openly say, yeah, we're going to need oil for decades, yet undertake anti-oil policies. In Canada, we have, a government that is trying desperately to shut down our coal and gas and oil industries in favor of green energy. We have an annual April Fool's joke that's played on our citizens in Canada, where they raise the carbon tax and tax us more, but we don't really seem to be reducing our consumption of these hard fossil fuels at all. But we're getting in a position where you're taxing energy and it's inflationary across the economy. So is government policy going to create an energy crisis if they don't recognize we're going to need all of it?
That's definitely potentially an outcome here. Yeah, I mean, the whole green energy transition is somewhat of a contradiction, especially for the Western countries who do one thing and say another. But the quicker they realize that we need both, the better it will be for the citizens of the countries in which they are governments, because the more energy produced that we produce globally, the cheaper it becomes. So, if they fail to, for example, Canada fail to return to oil production meaningfully, that will translate to a higher cost of living for Canadian citizens, which is already the case, I believe. I see a lot of citizens who are essentially looking elsewhere. I mean, there's a guy called Andrew Henderson of Nomad Capitalists who I follow quite closely, and his whole premise is to go where your money's treated best. And right now in Canada, I would certainly argue that that is probably not the case. I mean, you can speak for Canada, but from what I'm hearing, it's not conducive to financial thriving. It has this kind of suffocating effect on people with the high taxes, and that's obviously related to the way that the energy policy is rolled out as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. We've been facing some pretty high inflationary costs. People want to blame it on the central bank, but government is for the last decade began taxing energy, and they keep increasing the tax rate on it.
Right.
I think it's up to 35 cents a liter now in carbon taxes after April the 1st. I might be misstating that and might be over that value, but I believe we're up another 5 cents a liter on April 1st, which is tomorrow, to deal with the increase in the carbon tax. And as I say, it's certainly not reducing the consumption of fossil fuels in the country, as you pointed out, and we're no different. They continue to increase. So I'm old enough to remember the 70s. I was a kid, but I was, old enough, a kid, to kind of sort of understand what was going on. And as an adult, as I look back, the stagflation of the 70s was created by the Saudi oil embargo, essentially, which was an energy crisis. And I feel that Western governments' aversion to old energy could be leading us down to another stagflationary period,
Yep.
brought about by another energy crisis.
Absolutely. And that's a huge possibility. I mean, when you consider the unsustainable monetary trajectory that governments are on across the world, the US adding 1 trillion of debt around every 100 days, the governments will be stupid not to choose what the cheapest energy is, produce it to translate to an improved cost of living for the citizens. Otherwise, there's going to be some serious potentially protests, potentially revolt, if you extrapolate it out far enough. And, ultimately choosing the cheapest energy will be the solution to that, which is why old energy will still be, present in the energy mix for the next couple of decades at least, maybe more.
Yeah, well, I want to see less headlines that came out of California last summer where they're asking you not to plug in your electric vehicles because the grid can't help you charge them. So
That's it.
Yeah.
And the infrastructure isn't there, as we covered in our previous podcast.
No. I want to thank you for your time. This has been a very good conversation. And for those who want to get some more meat and potatoes into the topic, please read Ted's article. It's a good 5-minute read, but it's pretty in depth as to the role of the old energy in the current economies and its future. Happy Easter to you, Ted.
Thank you, Mike. I just wanted to add one more thing as well, a bit of a shameless plug. I've just set up a new website where you can find all my links. It's tedjbutler.com. So you can find all the publications I write for, the Prospector News, of course, the Morgan Report, the Ingoldsby Trust Report, which is actually set to be published on the 17th of May this year. I'll be writing the silver chapter in addition to the asteroid mining and deep sea mining chapter, which was very much fun to write. So if you're interested in taking a read at that, then please go to my website. Thanks for having me, Mike.
I will make sure that website is attached to the comments area as well. And there's nothing I like better than my guests giving shameless plugs on the podcast. So it's all good.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Ted. The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.